Hello everyone, welcome back to the Zach F1 channel, and my god, it has been too long since I have done an F1 fantasy video. I have my chips video coming out at the exact same time as this, so you can watch both of them. But yeah, this break from F1 was horrible, because at least with the summer break, you sort of know what you're getting yourself into. But this basically was summer break part 2, and it was painful. But we're back onto it. It's a sprint race weekend, so lots of action to get into. And that means a lot of interesting things to discuss for F1 Fantasy. But before we get into that, if you like what you see, like and subscribe. Follow me on Twitter for more F1 Fantasy news and F1 in general news. And join my Discord for more discussions with like-minded people on F1 Fantasy. So hey, let's get straight into it. So, like I mentioned, it is a sprint race weekend, and this means a lot in F1 Fantasy terms, because that means most people will probably be using chips, there are more points up for grabs, and just in general, there's a lot of excitement when it comes to a sprint race weekend, because if you have a DNF in both of those races, you're finished. But basically, I'll put on full details for my other video about how to use the chips for Cota, which ones are the best, which are the worst. But I'll give you a quick rundown right now for the sprint weekend. With extra DRS at Cota being the best option, then Limitless being the second best, and autopilot and no negative being the third best. However, like always, this means that we get to see the sprint quali before the team deadline takes place, so we'll know what chips to use and what teams to bring in, sort of, which makes our lives quite easy. F1 Fantasy terms, it's all about just not getting any DNFs. But anyway, now that you understand the sprint race weekend and why it's so important and what chips you could potentially use, let's head on to the normal F1 Fantasy talk. So, when it comes to Liam Lawson, he has been confirmed to have a 10-place grid penalty for Cota, but he is very rusty. So, you could have a potential of him starting at the back of the grid. Maybe there's some DNFs, or maybe he does get those overtakes, especially on the Salvers. That's most likely going to happen, and he gets a few points. However, he's still very rusty getting into that seat, so it's a little bit dangerous. However, because it's a sprint race weekend, there is more than one race, so be careful fully committing to Liam Lawson before the sprint qualifying, because also we know VCARB haven't been the strongest so far at this point of the season. But for now, it looks like Liam Lawson is a great option at 10.2 million because he's cheaper than Hulkenberg and Magnussen. And with that 10-place grid penalty starting at the back of the grid in F1 Fantasy terms, because you can get positions gained and overtake points and basically get no negative points unless you crash out, it's a very juicy proposition. But that leads on quite nicely to the best drivers for under 9 million. And for me, first place goes to Cota. Now, there's a reason for this, because he is 6.3 million and he is getting you consistent points at the minute. He's getting you more consistent points than Alex Albon. So, in a Williams that looks pretty decent right now to be able to get close to the top 10 on his good day, and it can overtake quite a few cars, which is going to be useful, I think Franco Colapinto is a must in every single F1 Fantasy team. Then second place is Alex Albon, and he basically is Franco Colapinto again, but the issue is he's 2.5 million more expensive than his teammate. And considering F1 Fantasy is all about the premium drivers and the constructors, that 2.5 million could be better used in your team elsewhere to get better premium drivers, like I mentioned, or better constructors. So for me, Alex Albon gets second place. Now, third and fourth is a little bit interesting because it's both the Salvers, but like I mentioned, they've got a little bit of that dud driver ability of where if they are just at the back and there are DNFs, then they get position gain points and they still get that 0.5 million. But for me, even though Zhou's been a little bit better than Bottas the last 2 weekends, I do, with my full heart, think Bottas is third place and Zhou fourth, just because now there's a 0.7 million gap between them, so there is quite a big price increase from Bottas to Zhou, and there's not a crazy points difference. So yeah, Bottas for me third place and Zhou fourth. But bear in mind, a lot of these drivers are going to be in people's teams because you need to have the cheap drivers to get the best premium drivers. So with that being said, let's talk about the best middle cheap drivers. First place for the cheap middle drivers, it is Liam Lawson, and that is because of his 10-place grid penalty, and I sort of mentioned it earlier on in this video. Now, it is a close call between him and Hulkenberg, and I do think it's not a whole 100% that Liam Lawson is going to be better, but when you have a 10-place grid penalty, it's worth going for that extra driver. So that's why he's my number one pick going into this weekend. Then it's Nico Hulkenberg. Like I mentioned, he's very consistent. He's not going to get you crazy amounts of points, but out of all of the cheap middle drivers, and actually just out of all of the cheap drivers, he's the most consistent for races. for me, it's a no-brainer to have him in as second place. And then third, you have his teammate Kevin Magnussen. Now, he had an off day in Singapore, but he's usually pretty decent. But the thing is with him, he is a very high-risk, high-reward driver. Like you can see here, he got a lot of points in China on a sprint race. This is what he can do when he gets overtakes and positions gained, because he tends to do worse in qualifying, but get those overtake points, which is not really what Hulkenberg can do. He's more of a safe, consistent driver. But if Magnussen is on his day, he will outscore all of the other cheap drivers. So for me, it's one of those risks. If you're willing to take it, take it. But just be aware, he's probably one of the most likely drivers to get one of those DNFs this weekend. And then honestly, for me, that is about it. The rest of the cheap middle drivers, you sort of spin a wheel if you're going for any more. And that is because if you have more than 3 middle drivers, that probably means you're having a single premium driver build. And realistically, we're not looking at those anymore. And if you are, then I would most likely go for someone like Lance Stroll as an honourable mention. So I still think he's a decent option, but he's very expensive at 14.4 million. But the likes of Gasly, Ocon, Tsunoda, they're all now too expensive, and they're not outperforming Colapinto. They're not outperforming Albon. Geez, in the last race, they've not been outperforming Zhou by that much. So there's not enough of a reason to go from those cheap drivers to the cheap middle drivers. So for me, stick to trying to get Hulkenberg and Magnussen in your team. And if you can't, don't worry about the rest. Go down to those cheap drivers. Moving on to the premium drivers. And again, my life is pretty easy. So, like I mentioned, I'm going to be mentioning this quite a lot. It's a sprint race. So the sprint quali means that we can sort of see what's happening. And with premium drivers, that is everything. Because say you're not using a chip, but even if you are using a chip, your 2 times is so important. And it doesn't really matter this weekend, because you're going to see who gets on pole. You're going to see if it's by quite a big margin, what their qualifying pace is like for the actual qualifying as well. So it's a good way to know who's the 2 times. And for me, it's still going to be McLaren versus Ferrari. Now, Ferrari kind of screwed it up last weekend, so we'll see what happens. But 100%, Norris is the top dog you want. He's cheaper than Verstappen. He gets more points than Verstappen these days. He's the most likely driver to get driver of the day and fastest lap, all contained into one bubble. So for me, he's the number 1 dog. Now, the reason that he's number 1 also is because joint second, slightly better, is Charles Leclerc, because he's the differential. He could go for that first place and still be affordable. He's only 25.3 million. But Oscar Piastri, Lando Norris's teammate, who I put just in third, just behind Leclerc, is because he is a very consistent driver. He'll get you your second place. He'll get you sometimes first places, but it's now, I've always said this, it is very much in that point where if Piastri's first and Norris is second, Piastri will give Norris the place. Even now, I think if Piastri's third and Norris is fourth, I think they'd switch the cars around. So Piastri's always going to play second fiddle, which is a little bit scary. But we know how fast that McLaren is, and that's why he's the consistent option, always getting you decent points. But for me, if you want a 2 times driver, it's got to be Norris or the differential of Leclerc. And if you can afford Verstappen, he's an honourable mention. However, most teams can't afford to have Norris and Verstappen, and it's not worth having Verstappen, Piastri, Verstappen, Leclerc. It's much better to have Norris and someone else. But I will also say, if you can't afford to have Norris and Leclerc or Norris and Piastri, because I do believe it will be another Norris plus another premium driver race, then you go to the likes of Sainz or Hamilton. Basically, whoever looks better out of the Mercedes or the Ferraris, you pick that driver. And for me, it's most likely going to be Sainz, just because I think Ferrari are going to be faster in Cota. But hey ho, if they're not, we've seen it in sprint quali, and then you just choose Hamilton instead. And that wraps up the premium drivers, as I wouldn't really go near Russell or Perez as of now. Now, the best constructors, again, is pretty easy to decipher, because McLaren is 100% got to be in your team. That is a no-brainer. Oscar Piastri and Lando Norris both have been doing very well in that McLaren. They look like the top dogs for the rest of the season. However, then you got that Mercedes-Ferrari battle, but like I mentioned, you just pick who looked better in sprint qualifying. For me, it's going to be Ferrari most likely. And then you have Red Bull as that differential option, and that's purely because they're just too expensive, and I wouldn't really go near them, because look at this. They haven't outscored both Mercedes and Ferrari since Belgium, so realistically, they've been 3rd or 4th best constructor each weekend now since the summer break. So it's not worth it for where they are right now, and it's all because of Perez. So price-wise, bad. points-wise bad, I would very much stick to McLaren past Mercedes or Ferrari. And for me, probably McLaren and Ferrari. And with the team selections, you can really have 4 sort of teams, and that is the Norris-Leclerc build, which has Norris, Leclerc, Lawson, Hulkenberg, Colapinto, Ferrari, and McLaren. Now again, if you can't afford exactly that, my option would be to go from Hulkenberg down to Albon, and then Lawson down to one of the Saubers, depending on what you can afford. I would even go to double Sauber this weekend if that's only what you can afford. Because of it being a sprint race weekend, you really want to get those premium drivers right. Then you have the exact same team, just with Oscar Piastri instead. This is the more careful route, because with Leclerc, he's very much a differential who could put the fight to the McLarens. But as we know with Piastri, he'll probably give the position to Lando Norris if they're 1 and 2, so he's a little less juicy to pick. But consistently, McLaren look like the top dog. So if you're getting second place Piastri points, that is still brilliant as a second premium driver. And then the other alternative is, if you have a crazy amount of money, you could bring in Verstappen and Norris. And of course, that would be great if you had extra DRS for that, depending on what's going to happen, but also just for your team in general. And I would go to double Sauber if Verstappen looks good to get in Norris and Verstappen this weekend. But we'll have to wait and see after sprint qualifying what happens there. And then finally, the only different version of a team you could have is the single premium driver build, which would have Norris, Hulkenberg, Magnussen, Lawson, Colapinto, McLaren and Ferrari. And this is obviously for Lawson's 10 place grid penalty, and then getting double Hassan, the next 2 best cheap middle drivers. And then, of course, Colapinto, because he's cheap and he will get you similar points to Albon. So realistically, with Norris as your 2 times driver and all of those cheap drivers with the best constructors, you're still going to do decently. But it is a shame with these sorts of teams that obviously it's because you don't have that budget to compete with the other teams with 2 premium drivers. But this is going to be as good as it gets for you lot. But honestly, that is all from me today. Those are the team selections you can have. I've gone through the best drivers and constructors you can have this weekend. Bear in mind, there's a lot of overtaking at Cota, so we'll see what happens. But because it's a sprint race weekend, it's a very short and to the point video. Everything sort of relies on that sprint qualifying session because we can lock in our teams. And also because I've got an extra chip video coming out, that's why this video is only going to be about 12 to 15 minutes. And that one's another, I think, 6 to 8 minutes. So that's why it's a little bit spread out a bit more and a little bit shorter this video. But anyway, I hope you all enjoyed this video and I hope you all got something out for your F1 Fantasy team selections. I hope you all enjoy this weekend of racing because it's been too long. And hey, I'll see you all in the next one. Hope you all enjoyed. Bye bye.